Welcome, everyone. My name is McKenna Mezzastrano, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Sephardic Studies Program in the Strom Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Washington. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual conversation, Insights from a Half Century of Ladino Studies with David Bunis and Devin Naar. This event was supported by our colleagues in the Strom Center and the Departments of History, Linguistics, Near Eastern Languages and Civilization, and Spanish and Portuguese Studies here at the University of Washington. This summer has been a unique season for the Sephardic Studies program. Since about November of 2019, we had been preparing for Professor Bunis to join us in Seattle, beginning in June, to teach 2 summer courses on Ladino language and culture here at the University of Washington. And of course, we were very much looking forward to this summer. Professor Bunis is the chair of Ladino Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and also the leading authority in the Ladino language. He has also authored a highly regarded Ladino language textbook and is an expert in Solitreo, the traditional Sephardic Hebrew cursive script. In short, there is really no one better to teach a university Ladino course. But none of us could have predicted the uncertainty that February and March would bring. And due to the coronavirus pandemic and subsequent travel restrictions, it quickly became clear that Professor Bunis would not be able to spend the summer with us here in Seattle. Nevertheless, with our supportive staff in the Strom Center and with Professor Bunis's creativity and flexibility, we coordinated 2 completely virtual summer Ladino classes, which Professor Bunis taught from his home in Israel. These were the only university-level Ladino courses offered in the United States. There were nearly 50 students between our 2 Ladino courses this summer, ranging from undergraduates to PhD candidates. They tuned in from Seattle, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, Athens, Montreal, and several other cities around the world. Students have already told us that Ladino language and culture here at the University of Washington has been among the highlights of their academic careers. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Devin Naar, who will introduce Professor Bunis today. Dr. Naar is the Isaac Alhadeff Professor of Sephardic Studies, an Associate Professor in the History Department, and the Sephardic Studies Program Chair at the University of Washington. He is the founder of the Sephardic Studies Digital Collection, the largest digitized collection of Ladino texts in the world, housed right here at the University of Washington. Dr. Naar is the author of several articles and the award-winning book, Jewish Salonika Between the Ottoman Empire and Modern Greece, which was published in 2016. And now, Devin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Boirun, bienvenidos. Thank you all for joining us today, whether it's the morning, the afternoon, or evening, as I know we have an international crowd today. Buenos dias, buenas tardes. First of all, thank you to McKenna Mezzastrano, who is the Assistant Director of Sephardic Studies, for really taking the lead on this event, and to all of our staff in the Strom Center, especially Emily Thompson, as well as Kara Schoonmaker and Sarah Zaydes-Rosen, as well as Ty Alhadeff. I'd also like to thank the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation for supporting the Sephardic Studies program more generally, as well as the Sephardic Studies Founders Circle. And once again, many thanks to our co-sponsors from NELC, to Spanish and Portuguese, linguistics and history, and that wide cross-section of support and interest across campus, I think explains why we have well over 200 guests registered and participating in today's program. So welcome to everyone. I'd like to begin on a personal note, which is that when I first began my forays into the study of Sephardic history and the Ladino language nearly 20 years ago, there were really very few resources available to guide someone like myself, an uninitiated researcher. And at that time in college, one of my great uncles had given me a stack of family letters written from Salonika to my relatives here in the United States. And the only thing that I could make out on those letters were the dates from the 1930s and the 1940s. And they were written in this kind of squiggly, handwritten cursive that I couldn't really make heads or tails out of. And I asked my great uncle, I said, what language is this? And he said Spanish. And I thought, I was like, this can't be real. He said, it's our Spanish. But he said, but I can't remember how to read it. Nobody can read that script anymore. And he was right insofar as I went around asking professors at my university, at other universities, some rabbis and other very learned people if they could help me decipher these texts. And I couldn't find anybody who could help me. Finally, in the library, through interlibrary loan, I was able to get a hold of this little booklet published in the 1970s called A Guide to Reading and Writing Judezmo by one David M. Bunis. And this little guide, I mean, my original photocopy of it is in tatters at this point, but it was like a lifeline for me, and it was one of the main ways in which I was able to begin to decode my family letters with the help of a couple of friends I found on the internet that opened up an entire universe to me, the world of the Sephardim, of the Sephardic Jews, of the Ladino language, of the Ottoman Empire and Greece, and so much more that catapulted me into my current career as a historian and teacher. Now, I don't know if David knows this, but he, in effect, has been a mentor for me for many years, nearly 2 decades, through his scholarship, even prior to us initially meeting maybe 15 years ago. And over those decades, and many, many more, that David has dedicated himself to advancing and developing the field, what we might call Ladino Studies. I'm going to talk about the name Ladino and how that is a kind of a provocative term in some circles. But I would like to emphasize the extent to which David has blazed a path in this field. With more than 100 scholarly articles and several books to his credit, he has explored Ladino in many facets: linguistic, cultural, political, and more. His work brings us from Spain to the Ottoman Empire, with a special emphasis on that Eastern Mediterranean world in the more recent centuries, places like Salonika and Istanbul and Izmir and Rhodes, and places further afield like Vienna, which at one point had an important Ladino-speaking community and publishing industry. We learn from him about the development of the language, the different linguistic influence and structures from Turkish or from Hebrew and Aramaic, and we learn about the debates over the name of the language, about proverbs, about the politics of the language in modern times, those who defended the language, those who opposed it, those who wanted to reform it, what the Zionists thought, what the socialists thought, what the assimilationists had to say about the language. And we learn about the role of the internet, and groups like Ladino Comunità are playing in advancing the study and preservation and development of the language, and so much more. As a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, one of the first scholars really holding a tenured professorship for the study of Ladino, Professor Bunis has won major grants and prizes for his scholarship, the Emmett Prize, the Israel Prize for Jewish Languages, that really render him one of the leading authorities in the field. As McKenna mentioned, as a visiting instructor here this summer at the University of Washington, David has had the opportunity to interact with several dozen, closer to 50 students. Many are from the University of Washington, but many are also from universities across the country and beyond. And I would just like to make special acknowledgement of the role that our dean, Bob Stacy, and his office have played in making Professor Bunis's summer teaching possible, and also providing us with some resources to enable students across the globe to access this unique teaching opportunity. We were hoping to get maybe 15 applicants for the courses, maybe 20 would have been great. We wound up getting 60 applications for fellowships, and we were not able to support everyone who applied, but I think this overwhelming interest, both here in Seattle, among students, and among our access students, among local community members, heritage speakers, that makes learning Ladino in Seattle that much more significant, is really, really a testament to the importance of our initiative. And it's really a credit to our administration, and especially to Dean Stacy, for the support that he has shown for our initiatives. We've even had a couple of faculty members signed up and following the courses as well. I would just like to emphasize that David doesn't mess around in his classes. You know, he teaches them the Hebrew alphabet on the first day, and that's something that a lot of people are not aware of, that Ladino has historically been written in the Hebrew alphabet, in a variety of different Hebrew alphabet. And if you begin with the alphabet, that provides you with the opportunity to access the vast yet largely unstudied texts in the Ladino language that exist and which have not really seen the light of day, many of which are now digitized as part of our Sephardic Studies digital initiative. And some of David's students have actually been dealing with these texts in their own coursework. So you might learn how to buy pepinos at the charshi in his course, cucumbers at the market, but more importantly, in David's classes, students have the opportunity to access this rich repository of the textual tradition of the Sephardic Jews of the Ottoman Empire, to open up a largely closed-off heritage, much as the case is for Ottoman Turkish, which was historically written in the Arabic script, and also to gain a sense of the ways in which Jewish culture operated, not only in Spain, but especially in the Ottoman Empire, and how Jews interacted with their Christian and Muslim neighbors, and how all of those interactions and transformations are embodied in this language, in this Jewish language, that I think has something very important to tell us today. And I think students agree, and I just want to provide you with one short snippet of what a student wrote about David's class from the summer session. This student has nothing to do with, had no prior exposure to Ladino, and had no knowledge of Ladino prior to taking the class. And the student writes, "Thank you so much for the class and everything you taught me," he writes to Professor Bunis. "I really appreciated your perspective, knowledge, and the environment you were able to foster even in an online setting. By far, the Ladino class has been one of my favorite classes of college, much due to your ability to teach and to talk to this class. However, that does not mean the class was not challenging. It was a new topic that pushed my boundaries, but I grew a lot, both in terms of my understanding of Ladino culture and language, and my ability to take in brand new material and work with it, slowly but surely." So without further ado, I'd like to bring David together with me, and I'd like for us to begin our conversation. So I think David is with us.
Yes, Devin, thank you very much. I'm reminded of a conversation that I had, it must have been 20 years ago, with a man who I became very friendly with in Istanbul, a man named Baruch Pinto. Some of you may be familiar with some of the books he's published. He was an elderly man and very hospitable to me. I was a foreigner in Istanbul. He brought me into his house many times, and I once complimented him on his knowledge of the history of the Jews of Istanbul, and his reaction was simply, "Estağfurullah," which is a kind of a Turkish expression that's used also by Sephardic Jews. I don't know what the English equivalent would be, except that I feel humbled by your introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It's really wonderful to have you with us, and I'm sorry we're not doing this in person. But I'd like to go back. You've been involved with Ladino studies and the study of Jewish languages for more than 40 years, approaching a half a century in not so many years from now. But I'd like to begin sort of at the beginning, and I'd like to ask you to take us back to your youth for a moment in New York, in Sheepshead Bay. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about how you wound up encountering Ladino, because this was not a language that you heard in your own family or in your own immediate environment, but it was something that was in your proximity that it seems to me sparked an initial awareness and interest. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. I grew up in Borough Park, and then we moved to Sheepshead Bay. And in Sheepshead Bay, there was a Sephardic synagogue. That was one of the places I began to become familiar with Ladino-speaking Jews. But before that, I had been going to Hebrew school. Children of my generation went to Hebrew school after school. And we were studying mostly biblical Hebrew, and I really couldn't manage much with it, and my fellow classmates couldn't either. But toward our bar mitzvah, they, for some reason, started to have us read and write Yiddish. And I saw words, and as I started to read the Hebrew letters, which I knew, I suddenly realized that I knew those words. And it dawned on me that actually I knew some Yiddish and had no idea before that I even knew the language. so that was my first encounter with, let's say, a Jewish language other than Hebrew. And then I remembered this fascinating experience, which I really remember practically as if it were yesterday. A few years afterwards, I was in the house of one of my uncles, Matt Aronson in Brooklyn, who had a rich library, and he was also interested in Yiddish, and he had a copy in his library of Uriel Weinreich's College Yiddish. Some of the participants may be familiar with it. First of all, I was very impressed with the scholarly introduction that he gave to the Yiddish language, but maybe more than anything else, I was fascinated by a chapter in English on Jewish languages. And the Jewish language that he illustrated by means of an image was what he called Judezmo. And he offered the Ladino translation of a part of the Bible. And that was my first encounter, actually, with printed Ladino. I had studied Spanish, I had studied Hebrew, as I say, and this kind of Jewish Spanish sent me running to the library, and I read whatever I could find about the language, the Jewish encyclopedias, saw a copy of a clipping from the newspaper La Vara, which was published until 1948 in New York. And this really set me off on a trail searching for Ladino. I contacted the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and we met there a number of times, Devin, as you remember. And they said, well, we don't know much about it. We're devoted basically to the Yiddish language, but why don't you write to Henry Besso, who was a specialist in Ladino, and that's exactly what I did. They gave me his address. Everything was done by snail mail in those days. And Henry Besso turned out to be a very forthcoming man, an elderly man from Salonika. And he said, I can advise you to read a few things, but also I suggest that you put yourself in touch with a man in Jerusalem named Yitzchak Rafael Mocho, who was also from Salonika. And he told me that, he would be glad to try to help me out, but he also knew of somebody in Jerusalem, an elderly man who wanted to sell Ladino books. He had books, and he was afraid his children would simply throw them out when he died. So with the help of my parents, Marcia and Jack Bunis, I was able to buy a small collection of Ladino books from booksellers, elderly booksellers in Jerusalem. And that was really the beginning of my self-instruction in Ladino. I remember very clearly the day that a little booklet, which I had asked one of the sellers to send me, a booklet published in Salonika for children, a primer, an introduction to reading and writing Ladino. And this really was how I got into reading Ladino in the Rashi characters, which are the traditional, which is the traditional Hebrew font used to print most of Ladino publications. Now, yeah, please.
Oh, no, I was going to say, yeah, can you tell us? So you wound up heading to Columbia University and you were studying Jewish languages. Can you, and it seems like initially you were interested in, in Yiddish, when you had this you had this also awareness of Ladino. How did you wind up focusing on Ladino, and what was the status of Ladino studies at the time? Did people think that you were crazy for focusing on
well, they didn't. I don't know. I can't vouch for. I don't remember exactly what my parents thought. I think they thought it was rather impractical, but they let me do my own thing, which was really marvelous of them. And at Columbia, I started to study with Marvin Herzog, who was a student of the late Uriel Weinreich, who had published that college Yiddish text. And I learned from him that he was also interested in Ladino and Judezmo, as I'd like to call it. And of course, I went to Columbia calling the language Judeo-Spanish, and left Columbia calling it Judezmo, because first of all, it was pretty hard to come out of Columbia from the Yiddish department at Columbia and not call the language Judezmo. But when Herzog told me that he thought, as Weinreich had thought, that Judezmo was the best name for the language, I said, okay, it sounds all right, but let me do my own research. And as I started to research the subject, I found actually that many scholars who had come out of the Sephardic community themselves wrote that this is the way ordinary people in their communities call the language. This includes people like Salomon Rosanes, Michael Molcho, Avram Galante, Shabbatai Jaen. They all from each one from a different city, and each one saying, yes, the plain people in the city call their language El Judezmo, and they consider it a Jewish language the way that their non-Jewish neighbors, Turks, Greeks, South Slavs, also talk about their language as being the Jewish language. So at Columbia, Professor Herzog, Marvin Herzog, allowed me to do all of my papers about Ladino or comparisons between Ladino and Yiddish. And I did my master's thesis on modern dialects of the language, Ladino dialects, Judezmo dialects. And then my PhD dissertation was devoted to Hebrew and Aramaic elements in Ladino. So really, that was the way I acquired the tools for the analysis from linguistics and Yiddish linguistics, but always applying them to the Ladino texts. I think I may have mentioned that in the Brighton Beach, Sheepshead Bay area, there was a Temple Torah Israel, where I was able to meet Ladino speakers, hear people speak Ladino, especially weekdays in the basement where people would set up card tables. And, a lot of people were very anxious to keep the card games moving, and the conversations were entirely in Ladino, in Judezmo. And I had a chance to actually interact with people. They were very forthcoming. They commented on my pronunciation. They said, well, if you speak that way, your family must be from Salonika. And that expression, that's old hat. A young man like you doesn't have to use that expression. Use this instead. So they were kind of guiding me along the way also.
That's fascinating. And so I guess in some ways your foray into the study of Judezmo or Ladino took a slightly different path than some of the pre-existing scholarship. A lot of the scholarship on Ladino has situated the language within a kind of a Spanish or Hispanic studies context, drawing on some of the very powerful and potent narratives about, Ladino preserving the language of Cervantes and being, a reservoir of the golden age of Spain, and carrying that kind of tradition in the songs and in the refranes, in the proverbs. Your angle was a little bit different. Could you tell us about sort of how those approaches to the language relate to each other? And this is going to bring us, I think, to talking about the name of the language in a little bit more depth also.
Okay, sure. It cannot be denied that whatever we call the language, let's say Ladino, certainly preserves important features of Old Spanish. The Jews, the Christians, and the Arabic-speaking Muslims in medieval Spain shared a lot. They shared, for example, a certain sound system, basically. And when the Jews were expelled from Spain, they brought that sound system with them to wherever they went. Where they continued the language was basically in the Ottoman Empire, in parts of North Africa, especially what's today Spanish Morocco, and in parts of Italy, for example, in Venice. On the other hand, he who looks and is open-minded will find other features that were acquired after the Jews left Spain, and part of them features that were unique to the Jews even in Spain before they left. So by that, I'm referring basically to the Hebrew component, which also includes the Hebrew letter writing system that's been used into the modern era. As I mentioned, the newspaper published in New York, Lavara, was published in the Hebrew alphabet into 1948. My approach, one of the things that I enjoyed in Uriel Weinreich's work and other Yiddishists, modern Yiddish linguists, was the fact that they brought a very high level of linguistic scholarship to the field of Yiddish. And my attraction was, or my kind of goal was to apply the same kind of approach, but to Ladino. Because once I became very interested in Ladino and Judezmo, actually Yiddish was put on a back burner and Ladino became the primary focus of my linguistic interest. So I had gotten the tools at Columbia, and also my approach to the language as a Jewish language, with, for example, proverbs that can be traced back to Hebrew sources, a rich Hebrew and Aramaic component, incorporation of elements from the surrounding cultures, primarily Turkish, that had parallels in Yiddish in the Slavic component of Eastern Yiddish. And this kind of unique development, independent development of the language among the Jews who were very loyal to their Judaism, very loyal to their own group experience within the larger framework of either Ottoman culture or North African culture. This is really what attracted me about the language, and this is what I've been trying to impart to students and others who've become interested in the language, in the sense that this is not simply the language of Cervantes, as some would have it. It's the language of Cervantes in part, with many additional layers and unique features which can only be found among this group. And it turned out to me that the group was an extremely creative group. They not only preserved proverbs and songs from Spain, but from the time of the expulsion, they also began to create their own in this new environment, taking, for example, elements from the Ottoman musical traditions. So I remember many years ago at the Sephardic Home for the Aged in Brooklyn, speaking with, what was her name, Victoria Chazan, Mayesh, who was one of the last speakers, the Ladino speakers, who I was aware of at that time, who could also play the jumbush. She had an oud that she played, and no matter what song she would sing, she would always connect the melody of the song with the Ottoman makam, the Ottoman scale and the rhythmic pattern that was used in that song. So the Jews preserved and expanded and developed their own traditions, but were very much in touch with the surrounding cultures, and there was really a kind of give and take between the cultures. For example, musicians, Jewish musicians playing in groups with Turkish and Greek and South Slavic musicians. I guess they used a kind of Turkish to communicate with each other, but we have many recordings of Jewish singers who sang in Ladino and Turkish, Greek, other languages, French. And it was amazing for me to see that this was a kind of a fusion culture, a term that the Weinreichs, Uriel Weinreich and his father, Max, liked using with reference to Yiddish, because Yiddish evolved first in German-speaking areas, but then in Eastern Slavic areas, and Yiddish culture evolved out of this interaction with the surrounding cultures. And I was fascinated to find that Sephardic Jews created something analogous to it. And in a way, it's even more exotic because of the interaction of people who had originally spoken, I guess, a kind of Spanish in the Middle Ages, but then began to be in close touch with the various cultures of the Ottoman Empire. So it brought them even farther afield from Europe. And of course, it also reflects partly their original multicultural state in Spain under Islam and under Christianity. So they took with them this kind of cultural mix, and it expanded and developed when they reached the Ottoman Empire. And I guess I could call myself a kind of Yiddishist of Judezmo.
Well, I guess in that regard, perhaps, I mean, there is a big debate about the name of the language. And I guess, based on your description and also thinking about how I sometimes try to describe the language, I sometimes talk about it as a Spanish, Jewish, Ottoman, Pan-Mediterranean language, but that's a little bit long to say in one breath.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, could you first of all tell us why there has been such a debate over the name of the language? And it's been very intense. I mean, for many decades, I've observed some of these conversations and some of these discussions. I've read about them or heard from others about, almost coming to fisticuffs over the name. Is it Ladino, or is it Judeo-Spanish, or is it Judezmo,
Right.
or is it Spaniolit? And it seems to me it has something to do with the name being a token, a sign of the identity of the speaker. So there's a lot at stake here, and also a sense that the language and the people have not really received much attention or recognition in the American public or in the international kind of public. It's, you know, many people have heard about Yiddish, or they know a little bit about Yiddish, but sometimes Ladino, Judezmo, Spaniolit, Judeo-Spanish, whatever you want to call it, is kind of sometimes a forgotten sibling or long lost cousin of sorts. And so there's this element of clamoring for or desiring a certain kind of recognition or validation of the legitimacy of the language and the culture. Yet and I think everybody who puts forth a different name has this goal in mind. I mean, they want to have some kind of legitimization for the language, but they fiercely disagree over the name of the language. So could you tell us a little bit about what your take is on why there's such a debate over the name?
Yeah, well, actually, I benefited personally in my career development from this matter, because I was invited to come to the Hebrew University, where I've been teaching for 40 years, because the government felt that, and the university felt the time had come to have recognition of Ladino culture, and the understanding that Ladino language and culture had to be introduced within the framework of college of university courses, to the extent that today in Israel, all of the major universities teach either about Ladino, there's something connected with Ladino in the course program. I was very fortunate in that I was invited by the Hebrew University to develop a full-time program in Ladino Studies. All of my courses were either about Ladino in particular or Ladino within the framework of Jewish languages. So that was a very unique opportunity, as you mentioned. I think maybe the only program in the world at the time. What did I want to say?
Yeah, about the debate, the names.
Oh, the debate, of course, yes, right. Now, here you bring me back to a realm I'm not so sure I want to remember, but I must say, when I was a PhD candidate at Columbia, and I was asked by Marvin Herzog to start teaching a course, and of course, at Columbia, the course would be called Introduction to Judezmo Language and Literature. This met with unbelievably fierce resistance on the part of some Sephardic community members in New York. And it was a great surprise to Herzog, to the faculty members. They didn't remember seeing this kind of reaction to any course because of the name being used for, let's say, a language course, being arising from the use of a certain name. And I was asked to explain why I chose that name. And I summarized the research literature. I talked about the fact that scholars in the community had remarked that that was the name that the plain people were using for the language. And then I started to investigate the primary literature also, and found something interesting. In the Bible, in a few places, speaking in Hebrew is referred to. I can start speaking Hebrew. In one place, a general, an Assyrian general is asked not to speak in Hebrew in order not to frighten the people. Because the plain people understood Hebrew. They asked him to speak in Aramaic, which not too many understood evidently at the time. And they said to him, Al tedaber itanu Yehudit, don't speak to us. Today we think of it as Jewish, actually. Yehudit is one of the words that's even used for Yiddish, meaning the Jewish language. Of course, in the biblical framework, the reference was to the language of Yehuda, the variety of Hebrew used in Judea. Now, interestingly, in the Bible translation, the Ladino Bible translation that was published in Istanbul from the first half of the 18th century, 1700s, that passage was translated as non nos hables en Judezmo. So we see from that already in the first half of the 18th century, people were using the name Judezmo at least to refer to the Jewish language if it was in Hebrew. But interestingly, if we look at the Yiddish translations of the same passage, we also often find that the word Yiddish was being used to translate the same Yehudit. So the question is how the term was being interpreted. I think that the term was interpreted as the Jewish language, and then it was understood as the Jewish language even of the particular group for whom the translation was being created. So as far as I know, that's the first time Avlad in Judezmo, to speak in Judezmo, is used. That was in Istanbul around 1749, I think. I forget the exact date. Afterwards, we find more and more instances of the use of Judezmo as the name for the everyday language, not for Hebrew, but the everyday language of the Sephardim. In the 19th century, texts from Saloniki, from Izmir, from Vienna, you mentioned the Vienna press. Throughout the region, actually, you can find evidence that people were popularly using the name Judezmo for the language. So that sort of, for me, reinforced Weinreith's and Herzog's argument that that was the best name for the language. There was only one problem. I think because of the encounter between Sephardim and Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazim, and also because of the influence of the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, which really emphasized the Jewish experience in Spain as something very positive, and which could serve as a model for Jewish communities, modern Jewish communities elsewhere, the Sephardic Jews began to learn about their own history. And I think that's what led them to start using the name Espanol, and then under scholarly influence, Judeo-Spanish, and in Israel, because of the way new language names are created, using the it ending at the end of the word, the name Spaniolit, which also comes from Spaniol. So what I found, especially at the beginning of my career, I don't know whether it was because people were threatened by the name Judezmo, and then they saw that I wasn't such a threatening character. They sort of saw that, well, this guy can use whatever name he wants. We will simply continue to use whatever name we want. And you could say the Sephardic world and the scholarly world interested in Sephardic Judaism can be divided into various camps, each camp with the name that it prefers and the scholarly approach that it prefers to the language and the culture. So as you say, the Hispanists tend to emphasize what's in common with Hispanic culture. More and more scholars who are interested in Ottoman studies in a broad sense now include the Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire, and that's what's been bringing scholars from Turkey, for example, young scholars. For example, at least three of the students I have in the present term are from Turkey, Turkish speakers, Turkish-speaking women who are learning Ladino. And sometimes they make very interesting comments about some of the Sephardic figures. For example, in Istanbul, the philanthropist Abraham Camondo was cited because I mentioned him in a proverb. So that led to a discussion of Camondo's contribution to architecture in Istanbul. And then we'll be reading a description in the Ladino newspaper El Tiempo, part of which we saw at the beginning of the slide, a beautiful description of his funeral, which took place in Istanbul in 1873. So
what is your impression to why we have Ladino as the language, as the name that we use principally in the United States, and also it seems in certain like the National Authority for Ladino in Israel uses that name. How did that term emerge as kind of a dominant, maybe, or common, in common parlance in the States? People know Ladino more than other terms.
Yeah, it actually is a very interesting phenomenon. First of all, on the title pages of many rabbinic works in Ladino or translations into the language of Hebrew texts, you find the language is called en Ladino. But often you'll have the statement that this book fue trasladado de la Shona Kodesh en Ladino. It was translated from the Holy Tongue, Hebrew, into Ladino. And I think that's really at the crux of the true meaning of Ladino. It's used where there's an opposition between the opposition that's known in Hebrew among Sephardim as Lashon HaKodesh and La'az. La'az is the Hebrew word used by the Sephardic rabbis to refer to Ladino. And since it appeared on many title pages, and as bibliographies began to be produced of this literature, people kept seeing the name Ladino on the title pages. That's one reason why I think it may have gained popularity. And on the other hand, the name Judezmo does not appear on the title pages. Sometimes, but this is very late in the history of the development of the literature, you see Judeo-Spanish or simply Espanol. So the speakers actually had several options open to them. And then depending on their own ideology, their language ideology, they would choose whichever term they preferred.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a really interesting point about the distinction between Judezmo not necessarily appearing on title pages for the reason that you described, that this was a term that everyday people used to describe the language, whereas Ladino had a more literary kind of element, and the juxtaposition between Ladino being the Latin-derived language in juxtaposition to Lashon HaKodesh meaning the Holy Tongue, Hebrew, maybe also plays into that. And I mean, I think Henry Besso, who you mentioned, he was the one who helps develop the Library of Congress's cataloging system for this language, and he promotes the term Ladino in that context.
Right.
And so that
exactly.
helps explain why, because it also connects them to the Latin world, the Latin language world, to Europe, and then also to the grandeur of Spain. And so maybe there's a sense of some cachet that comes with that.
I think so. Yeah, I think that's a very important point. The fact that with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, a loss of status, especially in the second half of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the Sephardim were looking into possibilities of maybe extracting themselves somehow from the Oriental Eastern environment and a kind of a realignment with Western Europe. And they began to talk about the fact that they had started in Spain. They had come from a Western European culture. They identified as Spaniards in a way. And this was, I think, for some, a way of trying to change their status. At a time when to be Turkish, for example, in Vienna, didn't necessarily have a very high status, but to be Spanish in Vienna meant you had a higher status. And I think the Jews were playing with different possibilities. All of them, I think, were sincere components in their identity. It's not as if they were perpetrating a hoax. All of these components were true components in their history and in their historical and linguistic development. But they could tap into whichever component in their historical development and their identity seemed to be most suitable for the environment in which they found themselves at that particular time and in the place they were.
Great. We could go on for a very long time, I think, with this. I always enjoy speaking with you.
Right.
And I hope those who have been with us have too. I want to have one final question before we open it up for some question, which is that speaking about the contemporary moment and the future of the language. And as you're very well aware, commentators have been speaking about the death of Ladino, or whichever name we want to apply to it, for generations. But it persists, as we know, in pockets in Israel, in Turkey, even here in Seattle, where we're fortunate to have one of the most robust of the Sephardic communities in the United States. And it's still active in certain domains, in particular in song, in the food and cuisine, aspects of synagogue liturgy. And you've been obviously spending time with students who are interested in the language, and you have some access students, some community members who are also bringing their own experience of the language into the discussion. And so my question for you is, could you comment a little bit about the status of the language today, and maybe more so, what does the future of the language hold, both in an academic and a lived sense? How do you interpret it seems to me, a growing interest among students and the broader public? I mean, we have over 250 people here listening to your talk on a Sunday morning or Sunday night, depending on where you are. So clearly, there's a really vast thirst and interest in this language. What does the future hold?
First of all, we have to say, Ben Para Yosef, mashallah. May there be many more. And I think there are many more, for example, than when I started to teach. I started to teach Ladino in 1980 at the Hebrew University. There were 2 students in the class. A year later, there was 1 Japanese student, a specialist in Yiddish, who also wanted to learn Ladino. And over the years, the numbers grew. There was more and more interest and more awareness of Ladino. At the beginning, Ladino was sort of the language of the group that had brought you borekas. You know, borekas are very popular, the pastry, very popular in Israel. But now, because of I would say 40 years of scholarship, not only my scholarship, but an emphasis on scholarship and research into the Jews of the Eastern and Sephardic communities, the status, I think, overall, maybe not everybody would agree with me, but I think the status of Ladino has risen tremendously. It has grown. There's certainly an awareness, much more of an awareness of Ladino music. You pointed out Ladino, the music, food traditions of Ladino speakers, but also certainly the Ladino Authority for Ladino language and its culture has helped. Some of the local leaders, Ladino-speaking leaders, especially Moshe Shaul and the 5th president of Israel, Yitzhak Navon, made great contributions to bringing this language and its culture in respectable, serious ways to the Israeli public at large and to the Ladino-speaking public in particular. I think giving them a greater sense of pride in their community, in their historical traditions than they had before. So I hope that's the way, that's the direction things will continue to go in Israel. And I think, as you say, around the world, there's been growing interest in Spain, also in Turkey, in many parts of Europe, in Germany, for example, in England, more and more young scholars taking an interest in Ladino literature, asking to write their master's and PhD theses on subjects connected to Ladino, and the faculty members are acceding to their wishes. Then, of course, there's the problem of finding people who can direct the work, but there are such people, and I don't know about Ladino Judezmo as a living spoken language. We need more people like Devin Naar who will bring children into the world and speak with those children in Ladino, and that will certainly raise the number of Ladino speakers, but maybe try to influence others. I think Seattle is the perfect place to do it because I've been to many Sephardic communities throughout the world, and I must say that Seattle, in my opinion, is the Ladino capital of the United States. I've never been to a community in which I had a sense that Ladino is as so alive as in Seattle. And this is based particularly on many Shabbatot, Sabbaths, at the 2 synagogues, those of the Jews from Turkey, those of the Jews from the island of Rhodes. And in both places, there's, I think, a true Sephardic atmosphere. One can hear Ladino, one can hear it in some of the songs sung on the Shabbat, and I had the moving experience. I was very lucky to be in one of the synagogues on Shavuot, on the Shavuot holiday, in which what's called in Ladino la ketubah de la ley, the kind of metaphoric marriage contract between God and the Jewish people, which is read entirely. It was composed in Ladino, and it was sung, actually, it was chanted according to the traditional makam by several of the men in the congregation holding Sifrei Torah, and it was really a very moving experience for me, and I'm sure for the entire congregation.
Great. I would just like to emphasize what Professor Bunis said, that Seattle is the Ladino capital of the United States. I hope that everybody heard that, and And I think from the authority himself. And I mean, I hope it will stay that way. And I hope when the pandemic ends, everybody who's interested in developing a future for a living Ladino language, you should all come to Seattle, and we can really have an effort. We'll revitalize the language, we'll bring it out into the future generations. I mean,
Si quiere el Dios.
Si quiere el Dios. I'm kidding, not kidding, but
Yeah, you better do some building.
We have to build it up. We have to build it up. So I'd like to take a moment to open up for some questions. And again, thank you so much for your insights, David.
Pleasure.
A couple of questions here. I mean, there are actually many. Could you speak a little bit about this perception? You mentioned it earlier, and I think you began to speak about it. But one of the questions is about this conception of Ladino Judezmo as an oral language, and your emphasis on the sort of the literary side of the development of Ladino. And it's not to say that obviously it's a literary language, and obviously it's an oral language, a spoken language. I guess the question is, why do you think that there's been so much attention on the oral side of things, given there's not that much attention at all in general, but there has been some attention to the oral traditions and less attention to the written traditions?
Yeah, I think the fact that the language has traditionally been written in the Hebrew alphabet has constituted an obstacle to European researchers taking an interest. There's the famous case of the wonderful folklore researchers Sam Armistead and Joseph Silverman. And Armistead, I was in touch with him many times, and Armistead said, I don't have to know the Hebrew alphabet. I have Joseph Silverman. He knows the Hebrew alphabet. He can read the text to me. And it's a perfect collaboration. But European scholars who did not have a knowledge of the Hebrew alphabet often didn't make the effort to learn the Hebrew letters. So they were limited. Their research has been, in many cases, limited to texts that have been published in the Latin alphabet. And we really only start to see them from the 1920s and 30s on. So it's a much more limited literature. Some of it is transcriptions of works that had originally been published in the Latin alphabet. And we have to, I guess, point out that the communities of the Ottoman Empire were not very wealthy. They didn't have great luxury. Children often had to leave the home at an early age. They had to start working in the market. And they didn't have the luxury of sitting with books. So not a very high percentage of people were used to reading. This was changed with the newspapers, because as some of the newspapers began to publish articles in a more popular language, and some of the editors of the newspapers said this straight out. If there are people who sell vegetables and shine shoes, Ladino speakers, that if they now read the newspapers in Ladino, it's thanks to us, because we're publishing a newspaper in a language they understand. And it's from around this time that the literacy rate, people enjoying newspapers, reading the newspapers and books on Shabbat, where you can't work, this increased the literacy, the enjoyment, let's say. There was always literacy, because especially men had to be able to read the prayers in Hebrew. And the Ladino was written in the same language, but books were expensive. So people couldn't, buy books. And on the other hand, the oral traditions were something you didn't have to spend money on. People loved to tell stories, to sing songs. It didn't cost anything, and it gave the spirit a great enjoyment. So this was something that was widely done in the community. And as scholars came in and studied the communities, they learned about this and began to record, began to do transcriptions, and then we have the results of their research. So there's a lot of attention given to the oral traditions, which researchers could simply learn by hearing. They didn't have to read a printed book in the Hebrew alphabet.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for elaborating. I think it's a very important point to recognize that there is a written tradition that exists simultaneous to the oral and the spoken tradition, and maybe even some important dialogues between those two traditions. We have many questions here, so I'm going to try to offer some, pick a few here. for us. Could you speak a little bit more about the typefaces or the different styles of script? We have a number of questions about the relationship between the different Hebrew fonts, like the Rashi script, the Solitreo script, the Merubah, the block letters. In very bekitsur, if you could just very quickly maybe say, provide a little gloss or explanation as to why there are different alphabets of Hebrew alphabets.
I'll try to make it succinct. Yeah, the Torah itself is written by hand in merubah letters and square letters, and those have always been the letters used when a sacred text was written by hand or published. The Rashi font is based on the manuscript writing of the Spanish Jews in the Middle Ages. In the 15th century, when the first Rashi commentary on the Bible was printed, the Hebrew text was printed, the Bible text was printed in the Merubah, but they wanted a different font for the commentary, so as not to give the commentary the same status as the sacred text. So the typesetters used the handwritten Rashi letters. They used the manuscript writing of the Spanish Jews as the basis, as the model for the font. There's no connection actually to Rashi because he was a French Jew. He didn't use those letters, but because it was used to print the first Rashi commentary, it acquired the name Rashi, and it's actually in origin a Sephardic font. Now, in the 16th century, when Jews published books in Ladino, in the Ottoman Empire, they wanted it to be completely legible to the average person, so they used square letters with vowels, which boys learned in the religious schools. So any boy who could pray could also read a text in Ladino. But afterwards, people felt that it wasn't really necessary to print texts in Ladino with square letters and with vowels. People could read them in the Rashi font also, and it didn't require using vowels. It made printing cheaper. And so the Rashi font became the main font used to print Ladino from the 18th century on.
Great, fantastic.
And the Merubah is used for things like titles. It's kind of a boldface.
And then the Solitreo is the handwritten manuscript style.
And the Solitreo is the handwritten, right.
Okay, great. Fantastic. So could you tell us a little bit about, going back to your own experience, a little bit more about the dialogue between academic and community efforts to develop and document Ladino? We have a specific question. You had the Adelante Society at one point, and you published a newsletter for a number of years. Do you see those as two separate tracks, or where have they kind of intersected? And what does the future hold? I mean, in terms of the community dynamism and the academic track.
Yeah, I mean, it would be nice if there could be a complete merger of the two communities, but over the years, that hasn't really proven to be too feasible. So we tend to see the scholars, putting themselves in one corner, and the Ladino speakers kind of being in a different place, not so much interested in the serious lectures of the scholars, and in a sense, creating their own, I guess what you could call today, a kind of a popular academy of Ladino, exemplified, for example, in the Ladino Comunità social site. So it's a kind of place where people get together, they correspond, interact in various kinds of regional forms of Ladino. And if there's a question, the question is directed to the community. It's not when the late Chaim Vidal Seficha was still alive, they would sometimes address questions to him also as a member of the community and a respected elder of the community. But today, basically, it's the Academy of Ladino, the popular academy that discusses all kinds of problems that the community is interested in, etymologies of words, what does a certain word mean? Was this used in your dialect? I call a certain artifact by this name. Does anybody else know it by that name? Do people know it by other names? So these are all kinds of fascinating. I even at one time published an article about the fascinating discussion on Ladino Comunidad and today in other social sites in which Ladino speakers who are not necessarily linguistic trained scholars, first of all, show great interest in such problems and also venture to give their opinions and to offer explanations from their own personal experience. So I think, it's a kind of two parallel tracks. Sometimes they meet when scholars recognize this rich resource of the community for what it is. And then they also tap into it.
Right. Well, I guess that's sort of one of our goals at the Sephardic Studies Program here at the University of Washington is to try to build some of those bridges between the community and the academic, world through our digital projects and through public events like this. In some ways, is a merger of those two domains. We had a number of questions about technology and digital resources, and if you could comment on what do you think about the future, like if we had. Yiddish is well documented in digital and available online. There's HebrewBooks.org. Ladino is just starting to emerge, having a digital life or afterlife. What do you think the future of digital Ladino will be, and what will that add for interested community members and researchers in terms of digitization, search functions, machine recognition, machine learning? I mean, all of these things, it seems to me, would radically revolutionize the prospect of the transmission of the language, access to the language. What are your thoughts on that? And how do we...
Yeah, right. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Yeah, we see it all the time from resources such as the HebrewBooks.org, which focuses primarily on religious literature, the Historical Jewish Press site, which allows you to access some of the major newspapers that were published in Ladino, various online dictionaries, which are extremely important in that they provide one word or several synonyms of Ladino words. If a native speaker forgets the meaning of a certain word or encounters a word in a text, or anybody encounters a word in a text and wants to try to understand what does that word mean, there are now resources they can tap into in order to find answers to their questions. So the digital resource, the digitization project at Seattle and in other places is really, like you say, revolutionizing the Sephardic studies world, because it's bringing resources that were once just locked away in small libraries and had very difficult access if you weren't a scholar, an acknowledged scholar. Now, sitting in a person's home, he can access a bibliography, download entire volumes, and this, I'm sure, will have a tremendous impact on the general level of knowledge of Ladino for those people who are interested. The resources are no longer an obstacle. The way I had to go to the Milwitsky collection, locked away in a closet at YIVO Institute in the Upper West Side of New York, now I have access to most of the same works, at the press of the keyboard. I can get and download, not only see, but download those texts, search, because some of them have the search applications, and I can look for individual words. That also has a great impact on our knowledge of the historical development of the language. So it will be an entirely different world.
Okay, great. Thank you. I hope so. I hope we can work toward building that future. I mean, somebody commented here, we need a Google Translate in Ladino. I feel like we're a few steps away from that, but that would be marvelous. We have so many more questions here. We're just going to do maybe two more and then wrap up. One is, there are a number of questions about the relationship between Ladino and Ladino speakers and Spanish speakers on the one hand, and Turkey and Turkish speakers on the other. And do you think that, I mean, I used the metaphor of the bridge earlier. I mean, you discussed how, like, speaking about Ladino and mentioning Camondo opened up a kind of connection for people in your Turkish students. I mean, what role do you think, if any, Ladino can play in kind of bridging divides or creating kinds of new relationships between Ladino speakers or Jews, and also, on the one hand, Spanish speakers in the United States, say, and Turkish speakers or Muslims on the other hand?
Yeah, I think it's doing exactly that. And it's really a pleasure to see. It's something that I had hoped for along the years, and it seems to really be taking off now. First of all, in Spain, there's always been a significant interest from, I would say, the 50s, especially the 1970s. There's been great interest among certain sectors of scholars in Spain, and even among plain people in the what they call the Sephardíes. They use that name, which is really the Sephardic pronunciation. It should be Sepharadi, Sepharadíes or Sephardim, but they use that form. And students from Spanish universities have come to Israel. They've gone to other places in the world to study Ladino. They've published master's theses and doctoral dissertations on aspects of Ladino literature, folklore. So that has been in existence for years already. Another newer development is the interest on the part of scholars, and especially young scholars in Turkey, like our students who are participating in the course, where they're coming to understand that they have to not limit themselves, for example, in trying to understand the history of the Ottoman Empire to their own community, but they have to actually take into consideration all of the communities to the extent that they can, their languages, the literatures and cultures that were participating in this Ottomanism, and what led to Ottomanism before the 19th century. And they're therefore making the effort to learn Ladino, which is also a pleasure. And I've had very interesting and wonderful interactions with scholars from Turkey. They come to the Hebrew University. There was a volume published on communities of memory in Istanbul, and it was very important for them to have a conference in Jerusalem on the subject and to incorporate into their volumes articles on the Jewish community, the Jewish communities of the Ottoman Empire. So I think that will also lead to further and further interaction, I hope. I think and hope that it will lead to further and further positive interactions, at least in the scholarly world.
Yeah, si quiere el Dios, as we say. I hope so too.
Quiere el Dios.
A final question. And again, I'm sorry to all of those. We have maybe, I don't know, we have dozens and dozens of more questions, and I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of them right now. But maybe just to close on a more practical kind of question, but it's also maybe a philosophical question in some ways. We have a lot of questions here about resources, like dictionaries. And I guess, you've studied dictionaries, and I think it's a two-part question. One is the practical question of what are the best Ladino dictionaries out there, or at least what are the Ladino dictionaries out there, and also why has there not been more effort or attention to creating systematically accessible Ladino dictionaries, or like etymological dictionaries, or there's no really comprehensive Ladino English dictionary or even Ladino dictionary, and there are no dictionaries that go really easily from that represent the Ladino words in the Hebrew letters, and to which you can use then to derive definitions. So could you tell us a little bit about the story of Ladino dictionaries, and what is the status of those kinds of resources today?
Yeah, the story, it's a long and detailed story, a fascinating story, which we won't have time to get into much. But I think the problem is technical know-how, people who could produce dictionaries of that kind, and lack of resources, finance, the financial problem. Because dictionaries of the kind that you describe, a comprehensive historical dictionary of Ladino, would take a team to compile, and it would take years to compose. There are projects of the kind, bits and pieces of it going on, with very limited funding, and we're in a way stuck because of the technical and the financial side of the matters. Mm-hmm. But there are projects going on, I would say, if you know Hebrew, then you're in relatively good condition if you need to know the meaning of a particular word. And that would be the Ladino Hebrew dictionary that has been developed and is being developed on an ongoing basis by Avner Peretz in the Ma'ale Adumim Institute in Israel. It's accessible, I think, to University of Washington students online through the library. It's available to students of the Hebrew University online. And I think some other universities also have arrangements. So if you can read Hebrew, if a Hebrew translation will be helpful, I would say that's one of the first places to check online. And of course, the dictionary of Joseph Nehama, in many respects, is still the most reliable dictionary. It was produced by a native speaker. It has details on the use and meanings of words. Unfortunately, it was published and printed after the author died, so he wasn't able to proofread and correct many of the errors that crept in. I'm sure he would have had he remained alive. But that Joseph Nehama's Ladino French dictionary actually has been the basis, the model and the basis for most of the dictionaries that were published after. I think it was published in Madrid in 1977, and others simply took that as their stepping stone and built their later dictionaries based on Nehama.
Right.
So his memory is really treasured by those who do lexicographic work in Ladino.
Right. But obviously, as your response makes clear, you did not mention any dictionaries that are go to English, because there really are not systematic ones. I'm familiar with, Al Pasi's wonderful folk dictionary, which is very useful, and the Cohen's Ladino dictionary as well. They're useful, but we have a dearth of resources, especially for the English reader. So I guess what I'm hearing from you is we need to have another big fundraiser to create a historical dictionary of Ladino that will be available, so you can look at it in the Hebrew characters, and then you can get the definitions in whichever language that you want. Now, maybe we can get somebody to support such an initiative when you retire, si quiere Dios, then you'll be able to spearhead the international team to create the first historical dictionary of the Ladino Judezmo, Judeo-Spanish, the Jewish, Spanish, Ottoman, Pan-Mediterranean language.
What do they say in Ladino? Caminando y hablando.
Caminando y hablando. So may we have much more of that, of caminando y hablando. It's really been un placer, Professor Bunis, to speak with you today, and to thank you all very much, to our co-sponsors, to Bob Stacy and the University of Washington, to the Sephardic Studies Founders Circle and the Isaac Alhadeff Foundation for all of your support, and to the Sephardic Studies and Jewish Studies Strom Center team for making today's program possible. I think I'm going to turn it over to McKenna now to wrap it up. Thank you all very much. We'll download, hopefully, your questions. Please be in touch. If you'd like to reach out to me personally, I'm very happy to address your questions or to get them to Professor Bunis, and I hope we can continue the conversation. Thank you very much. Merci
Thank
mucho.
you.
Thank you all. I'd just like to echo what Devin said. Thank you to Devin and David, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you'd like to see more programs like this, please consider making a donation to the Sephardic Studies Program, which you can do at the link right here. And I'm also going to put the link in the chat right now. It's there. For any of our University of Washington students who joined us today, I wanted to just remind you that there are free mental health services available right now at the link in this slide. So that is just a useful resource to anyone who might need it. And otherwise, just thank you again to Devin and David for the great conversation. Thank you to our audience for attending and for your wonderful questions. And we hope to see you all again soon, either here virtually or hopefully very soon in person.